Patrick Cooch from the Carlton Footy Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
James Walker here from the Brisbane Lions.
Jason Johannesson from the Western Bulldogs.
Luke Parker here from the Sydney Swans.
It's Rory Sloane here from the Adelaide Crows, and you're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Matt Shaw, Melbourne Football Club.
This is Nat Fyfe from the Fremantle Footy Club, and you're listening to the Coaches Panel.
We've been talking about this week for a number of weeks, and it's finally arrived. The first of our 3 multi-bye rounds as we enter into round 12. Hello, it's MJ from the Coaches Panel. I hope you are well. And I've assembled a couple of members of the panel together to chat through some real big fantasy footy issues that we've got to deal with this week. I've got Rainman on the line. Hello, mate. How are you?
G'day, MJ. Going well, mate. You?
Oh, look, mate, always doing well after a win, that's for sure. And I've got Benny Gogos on too. Hello, buddy.
Hey, mate. Very exciting. It's the first week that we see those little blue dots next to the players' names.
Yeah, you do see those blue dots across all of your salary cap formats. It is best 18 on field that counts. So even if you have 20 on field, that's going to be whittled away. Those lowest 2 scores will bump out down to just your top 18 available players. And of course, if you have more players available in a certain line that can fit on ground, that does not count in the 18. It is only about what you can get on the ground that counts. Lads, there's some big stuff I want to get to. There's some injuries to some really important players, and one, then in a moment we're going to get to Lachie Whitfield. We've got to talk injuries to Sloane, Hearn, Dane Beams is important. Maybe not so much him specifically, but the kind of the flow-on effect of what an injury for him does. There's some buy strategy, some Patreon questions we want to get to, and if you want to support the Coaches Panel, plenty of ways you can do that, but one of them is to join the Patreon army at patreon.com/Coaches Panel. We'll get to their questions in a moment. But I suppose the biggest dilemma, trade move, whatever you want to call it, and I'll start with you on this, Ben, is around Lachie Whitfield. Injury during the week. A lot of people brought him in that didn't have him with a favourable matchup against Gold Coast. Got tagged by Nick Holman, then injured his shoulder. News came out Tuesday morning at a press conference with Leon Cameron. Confirmation about surgery to that collarbone. And not only will he miss these 3 multi-bye round games, but he's 4 to 6 weeks out of the club. First thing, I guess, and I want to get both your thoughts, but initially with you, Ben, is that a trade no matter what format you're in? Time to move Lachie Whitfield on?
Are we wasting time here, MJ?
Well, I just want to ask the question. All right.
Yes, mate. It is a trade every single day of the week.
What if you're down to 12 trades left and SuperCoach and DreamTeam, you've gone uber aggressive? Like, is there ever a ground?
If you've got one trade left, you're trading Lachie Whitfield this week.
Okay.
And the reason why is fairly simple. So round 12 looks like a week where not many people are going to struggle to field 18. It looks like everyone's going to be okay. Round 13 is going to be quite terrible. Any way you shape it, it's looking very tough at this stage. So I think it's likely that you're holding Lachie Whitfield right now. You're probably going to cop a 0, or look, best case scenario, you might pull on someone like a Robbie Young might come onto the ground and score you his 30 points, okay?
Right.
Then round 14 is also looking very tough at this stage. I think, again, best case, you're scraping 18, maybe 19. Let's just say you take another score of Robbie Young. So Robbie Young's produced 2 40s for you across those 2 weeks. Also, round 12, the week we're up to, we might get someone more like, say, Gibbons on ground who might give us a 60. So across those 3 weeks, best case scenario, I think a likely scenario is you're going to cop a 0. The best case scenario is you've totaled 140 points in those 3 weeks across 3, fairly average but predictable rookie scores.
Yeah.
And here we've got a guy named Lachie Whitfield who is priced at, in DreamTeam anyway, is priced at 783,000, and he's priced very similarly across the formats because he's been ridiculous this season.
Yeah.
You need to be converting that into at least 100 type scoring guy. And if you are getting 100 average across those 3 weeks, then MJ, you've made 160 points across those 3 weeks. Plus add on to the fact that we don't know when Whitfield's going to come back.
Yeah.
Plus add on to the fact that this is the type of situation where we can start to facilitate cash generation. So potentially, we'll get into it in a little bit, but potentially there's a few guys that are maybe underpriced at this stage, and we can start to look at unique and innovative ways to create cash because, let's be honest, there aren't too many rookies floating around. There's, Bewley's probably one, but there's not too many. So, look, I know Rob's going to try and make a case for Whitfield, but I think you might be a little bit drunk if you're deciding any other way than trading Lockie Whitfield at this stage.
Yeah, well, I've given you the tough assignment, Rainman. I'm not asking you to give me your opinion because I very much, from just the preparation work heading into this podcast, you're leaning towards the same. But where could the logic flow for someone to hold Whitfield? Is there logic that holds up, or is it just it's a trade, no matter what, move on?
Oh, it's a really tough case to make. I think the only way I could see logic in holding him a week. So holding him this week because you're really gunning for a round 12 defender, be it Luke Ryan in SuperCoach or Sicily or even a Connor Blakely, and you really want those guys, then maybe I could see something there. As far as long-term, look, you might be a supreme optimist and you talk around how some of these players are recovered in 4 weeks rather than 6 from a similar type surgery. Geez, you've got to make a case there. I think, to Benny's point, or you look at the total balance and score of your team, and how do you replicate what he could do or what that money could do for the points on your team? It's hard to sit on it and not actually take advantage of that coin.
All right. Well, there are definitely some options for us through there, and the great thing is, depending on what dual position players you may or may not have in different lines, the opportunity with Lockie Whitfield is, even if you've really got no cash in the bank, he can pretty much, no matter the format, get you to anyone you want. So if you are choosing to trade, and I think, Rainman's done a very noble job at trying to give reasons for why you should hold him. But let's look at some players. I know we could go for anyone, but maybe let's go kind of line by line. Benny, I might get you to pick me some defenders. Rainman, maybe there's some midfielders and some forwards, and if the others kind of miss a player that you think's worth touching on, then let's come back to them. But Benny, is there some defenders, whether it be from round 13 or round 14 buy structure, that it's worth making a real easy move for? And it pretty much, no matter who you get, you're going to make some cash out of, I suppose.
That's it, MJ. I think we need to be looking at this rather than just a one-on-one. I think we need to be thinking about this as a collective three-way trade. So, of course, we have 3 moves to make this week. So it's a very exciting time. And so I'm looking really down the list. I'm looking sideways. I'm looking at every possible avenue. So a guy that immediately comes to mind if you want to maintain buy structure and you want to make some dollars and maybe move on, say, someone like a Gibbons or a Drew or a Hayes in the midfield, would be a guy like Isaac Cumming at the moment.
Okay.
So priced way, way, way down. But he had a very good game on the weekend. And I think the exclusion of Whitfield, they don't play exactly the same role, but I think it's going to be positive for his scoring, if anything.
Does the return of Zach Williams hurt that?
Potentially, but I also think that Williams might have to play a little bit more of a wing role to make up for Whitfield.
Sure.
And either way, there is going to be ball to be won by someone there. You're also not looking at necessarily Isaac having to do too much, because I don't know about everyone's teams, but I know a lot of teams do have a guy like Dersma or Marty Hoare on the bench at the moment, just because we've been a little bit blessed with a number of rookie options that have done so well for us this year. So you might even be looking at a guy that you're thinking, hey, I think this guy might be able to make 100, 150K, maybe till round 15, round 16. And in that time, I can play Dersma because, hey, he's done 90s for the last couple of weeks. Or, hey, I can play Marty Hoare because he's a 75 type guy. If you want to look more at a sideways trade, the options aren't so great this week. So we're going to have to think some radical thoughts here. One of the ideas, which is a bit obnoxious, but something that I have been thinking through personally this week, is can I accept taking in a round 12 guy and actually making sure that round 13 and round 14 I have a much stronger round 13, round 14, I have a much stronger unit on field, because right now I'm looking at my team and I've got 20 players that are playing in round 12, but I'm going to be struggling come the next 2 weeks to, I'll be fielding 18 at best case scenarios. So potentially you're doing something that really goes against the psychology of everything we kind of talk about to this point. But at the same time, it might be the way to go, because if it allows you to then bring in an underpriced premium, and I think that there's a few very attractive premiums on other lines at the moment that are quite underpriced, I think that could be the way to go. So I'm seriously not opposed to James Sicily at the moment, and I know that's a pretty crazy thought to be putting out there at the moment, but I think that's something that I'm seriously looking at right now.
Is that, and again, Rainman, I suppose I'll pose the question to you again, knowing what Ben's just shared. Is that very much around just looking at your buy structure and the strategies that enable you to make a move like that? Or is that the opportunity to where you go, even if you've only got 18, 19 on field, you can make that move? Is it a luxury based on how many are on field this week, or is it about something a little bit more than that?
Well, I think you have to look at it as that. Sorry, mate. Sorry, I'll just jump in quickly. I think you've got to look at it as a three-way type transaction. So what does it allow you to do with the other two trades?
Sure.
Yeah.
And I think just on the back of that, Benny, I completely agree. You've also got to look at it as a 3-week stint as well. You can't look at the buys in isolation. So you've got to treat these 3 weeks as almost, you can't just think 1 week ahead.
Yep.
So you've got to think, to Benny's point, I think most people will probably be pretty well off in this buy more than any other for round 12. So most would have probably 18, 19 or 20 across this one. So maybe that's the chance to actually take a hit and have a bit of a look at it. I know round 13 is really hairy, particularly down back for most, because that's where most of the decent rookies probably minus Dersma are. So, the conversation where you could look at, hey, maybe if you didn't have a Jake Lloyd or a Tom Stewart, he might be a really good trade in. But then if you're already heavy in round 13 down back, you've got to think through that. So don't just think what it can do for you this week. What can it do over the next 2 weeks? And I think to Benny's point around starting to think a little bit laterally as well. So you don't necessarily have to think around where is this, I'm going to do a like-for-like replacement in defence. If you've got a Moore or a Burgess still sitting up forward, that might give you some flexibility. You might have a Dersma or Lockhart or an Ainsworth in the mid, and it might be a good opportunity to bring in, Josh Kelly, who's been on your list for ages. Or even, does Whitfield out open up the door for everyone's favourite bubble boy, Jackson Haitley? It could do. So I think you've really got to think across the 3 weeks, but also, to Benny's point, think across those 3 trades and what you can do if you want to use them, because there's probably an argument, and we'll probably get into that soon, around how many trades do you use this week depending on what your on-field structure looks like.
And again, for AFL Fantasy, you've got 3 trades a week, so you might as well definitely plan and build out how you want your side to develop over the next few weeks, but you've got these extra bonus trades really in this week, so it's certainly an opportunity to attack your on-field scoring while at the same time not making your side worse and impacting your scoring on the other grounds. But you're right, outside of Whitfield, and there's some more players I want to talk about, but outside of Lockie Whitfield in Dream Team and SuperCoach and an injured premium, because there are some others, Hearn and Sloan, and I want to talk about them in a moment, outside of an injured premium, in Dream Team or SuperCoach, is there a reason to trade this week?
Yes.
You want me to take that one?
Right, anyone. I'll throw it out there.
Well,
look, I'll jump in quickly, Benny.
Go on. Yep.
I think it's a good opportunity to, and depending on what your trades look like, and again your structure, it's actually not a bad opportunity to free up some cash if you can. So if you've got a Will Hayes sitting there doing nothing for you, maybe you take a punt and go early on Bewley, who's going to be on the bubble, and it actually frees up some cash for you. I'm actually pretty well off this round. I'm a little bit dicey in defence in round 13, and I've got Lockhart sitting there just staring at me mockingly. I'm potentially thinking of Lockhart to Bewley this week, which gives me nothing on field, but it gives me quite a nice cash injection coming into next week. to then start to upgrade to some of those round 12 players.
That's it. You also want to be looking at how quickly can I finish off my team?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a question that I'm always asking myself. And hey, if I'm going to make some moves this week that's going to get me to finish my team come round 14 rather than round 15, well, then I'm going to be looking at that. And on top of that, you obviously are taking into consideration the buys. But, last week it was a very interesting dilemma around the Riley O'Brien situation, whether you trade him to Max Gawn. Obviously, O'Brien has a very difficult 3 weeks or now 2 weeks upcoming, and he's made so much money. People went to Max Gawn and he outscored him by roughly 70 points across the format. So if he potentially does, say, another 30, then come round 14 or round 13, like if O'Brien's scoring about 70 points, then you've kind of made that 30 points with the Gawn move anyway, plus you've made that upgrade. And so therefore come round 14, you don't have to bring in Max Gawn. You can start to look at someone else, and it just forward pushes your potential upgrade strategy. So I'm never inclined to dissuade someone from upgrading at any time, really. And I think now is obviously a very strange period to be doing it. It's unusual, but I think we also have to be thinking a little bit innovative, a little bit different if you want to get ahead of the pack.
I think so. Well, let's go look at round 14. If you want to purely look at trading Whitfield in those lines, let's look at defenders. Is there probably the most obvious two that are there are Laird and Basher Hooley's just in a rich vein of form at the moment. Like he's going about 130 across the formats, give or take a little bit in his last three. Is there any other?
Could you really do that though? At this point, I mean, geez, you're paying $720,000 for him, MJ.
You are paying a lot of cash for him. $540 in SuperCoach.
Oh no, this really goes against the sell high buy low mantra. I mean, we've never seen him do anything like this. Obviously, he's in the richest vein of form of his career at a very unusual time in his career. He's definitely closer to the end of his career than the start. I would have loved the pick, say if you picked him up around round
a month
6,
ago.
you'd seen something.
Yeah.
Yep, you were very confident. And look, some coaches were smart enough to do that. I know our very own Fox picked him up about 4 or 5 weeks ago and has done atrociously well out of that trade. So, but now I really feel uncomfortable us talking him up in a trade light because he is so expensive and you need him to be performing at 110 plus for that to be a remote successful trade. So I probably wouldn't be recommending him at this stage.
All right. So Led's the one that's many had earmarked at the start of the year as a top 8 midfielder. He's been a defender, so he's been a little bit below that. Hooley, love that reflection. Who else could be looking at as defenders on that line? Is it a Perryman? Is it a Brandon Ellis? Is there anyone there, or is it now starting to look about the other options? Because Rainman, you mentioned guys like Josh Kelly, as a viable trade-in option through there. Dustin Martin, I suppose, in AFL Fantasy is a forward who's coming off a couple of tons now. Is that the areas we need to start looking and considering is round 14 guys? If for whatever reason our structure means we need to go from a round 14 to defender to another round 14 premium.
I think so, mate. I think we're starting to get really limited. The only other guys, and you're taking a huge leap of faith, is someone like Miller potentially. Right. If you wanted to back him in, or if you had a big kahunas, you could go for someone like Old Man Simpson, but that would take an enormous set, and it would be an enormous leap of faith to do something like that. So I think you're right. If you've planned your team well and you've utilised DPP, it actually opens some options for you. And I think there's, to your point, whether it be Josh Kelly or whether it even be, SuperCoach, it might be a really random left field Ben Cunnington who comes up against the Suns this week. Yeah. That could be a play to go, again, to Benny's point, a little bit left field to actually think how you can complete your team, who would be a handy M8, M9, particularly in SuperCoach. I wouldn't look at him in any other format. Why not look at something like that and take this opportunity to take that punt?
Ben, I'm seeing a few coaches see this as an opportunity to move on Lockie Whitfield, and fair enough too. But then transition it to a guy who had probably his, in fact, I think it is his career best score and definitely the highest score of the year in Stephen Cornelio, who just missed the 200 marker in Dream Team and Fantasy, just went over that in SuperCoach. Is this the right week to pivot towards someone like a Cornelio coming off such a strong week?
Well, it's a very interesting one, mate. So 1 week ago, he missed the final quarter against the D's. Got a 69 in Dream Team, and I think it was roughly similar in SuperCoach. He looked very sore. He's obviously a very tough, combative footballer, but geez, he looked sore. My jaw dropped when I saw his score against the Gold Coast Suns on the weekend, because I really thought, hey, I'll be happy if he just plays and, he does his best and gets through 4 quarters. That's my
Jags a couple of cheap goals and get to your 90 kind of thing.
That's it. That would have been perfect. And just thinking long term, because, hey, he's lost $140,000 worth of value in Dream Team right to that stage. He was not going to be someone that I was looking to trade. But he comes out and he absolutely kills the Gold Coast Suns. So, look, I'm in two minds here with my advice, because he is cheap now. He is $675,000.
In Dream Team,
type of guy that in Dream Team, yep. He is the type of guy that right now is priced about $120,000 under his starting price. We all know that at his best, he's one of the absolute best of the competition. Lockie Whitfield obviously plays a different role, but it can't hurt his midfield minutes playing with Whitfield out. Whitfield has been playing a little bit more inside midfield this year as well, so it's all looking fairly beneficial for him. With Kelly now in, Taranto in, it seems very unlikely he's going to get tagged at any stage. So, look, I'm not super negative towards this trade, purely because I'm looking at his price now and thinking, well, that's still of value. Obviously, last week would have been an absolute dream scenario to bring him in, but this is one of the guys that at his best, he is still an absolute, he's an absolute fantasy superstar. He's got the round 14 bye, so you're going to get a couple of weeks out of him. I'm interested to hear Rainman's thoughts on it, though.
Yeah, well, I think you can make that argument pretty well. I think it all comes down to expectation, right? Because he's not going to get 200 again. Yeah. Like, I would eat that hat that I would buy. But I think Benny raises a really good point. We always talk around buy low, sell high, and he is really low. But I think you've got to be really clear around managing the expectations around what that looks like. And do you actually start to look at fixturing? And I know their fixture's pretty good across the rest of their year anyway, and they're playing some pretty good football. But then also, who else is actually starting to come into a good run? Do you start to look at some players, and I'm putting a SuperCoach hat on here, who are actually in a rich vein of form, but are actually still pretty well priced, that are super unique? Because I think part of the problem with Cogs going so well last week, he's under everybody's nose now. So a lot of people are going to go there, and there is a bit of a strategy play around going a little bit more unique, particularly through the buys, to actually, to gain some ground. And I'm thinking of guys in SuperCoach, all round 13 buy, but 3 of the top 5 midfielders from a 3-round average score are all sitting there and are really poorly owned in Luke Parker, Mitch Duncan, and old Dependlebury. Yeah. So maybe you can look a little bit left field. But I think the main thing about Cogs is just know what you're buying into. To Benny's point, he looked really sore the week before, so I know he played out of his skin. How does he back that up? Does he back it up with a good 120, 130, which we know he can do? Or does he kind of taking on a little bit of extra run through, even though he's not out on that wing that Whitfield plays, but maybe it's a couple more mid-rotations. Does that actually bite into his tank? I don't know. I think we've just got to be cautious of looking at all the positives because there could be, a couple of negatives in there too.
Yeah, so Stephen Cornelio this week comes up against the Adelaide Crows. Then it is North Melbourne down in Tasmania at Bloodstone. And then for just a reference point, something that we talked about a lot in last week's episode with Rids, it was talking about looking at the final 4 weeks of the year, whether it be because of your league matchups for finals or it's that crucial time of year where you're going to either win it or lose it from an overall rankings perspective. He plays, and as does Kelly, Whitfield and the rest of them in GWS, Sydney, Hawthorn, Western Bulldogs and the Gold Coast Suns. It's a favourable fixture, but Ben, there is one kind of thing that it's a slight concern for me. Maybe I'm just reading too much into it when it comes to whether it be someone like a Cornelio, for example, who has been a bit banged up this year at different times. We look at that Gold Coast matchup, we go, hang on, he just came off a 200 or close enough to it in Dream Team and Fantasy. He's going to do that in, quote, the grand final week or final week of the year. Is there any cause for concern for players getting rested in round 23 now that we've got that match that week before finals? Is that still something fantasy coaches should be concerned about anymore, or is that something of years gone by where we rolled straight from home and away season into the finals?
Yeah, I think that what we've seen in recent years is that clubs are much more willing to play their blokes in round 23.
Yeah.
And that's purely around the idea that if you're not playing the guy in round 23 and then they have the bye, then it's been 3 weeks since they've kicked a footy in a competitive environment coming into a finals match, and that's fairly undesirable. A lot of coaches feel very uncomfortable around that. So, look, it's not a cut and dry rule. I would say on average that clubs do want their players to play around 23, unlike back in the day. But I will also say that, hey, if Cornelio's sore, then he's not playing around 23, mate.
Yeah.
But it's very, at this stage, it's very difficult to know how his body's going to be feeling. I wouldn't say with certainty that he is going to be one of the sorest blokes.
Yeah, it's 10 weeks away,
on the
isn't
list
it? Yeah.
by that point. Yeah, exactly. It's very hard to predict that at this stage. So look, in conclusion, I think you look at a guy like Cornelio coming off of a very sexy score against the Gold Coast Suns, and you're thinking, well, shit, like it looks very nice to me. It looks very, very nice, the fact that he's playing Gold Coast Suns in round 23.
Rainman, we've talked about Cornelio, we've talked about Kelly. I don't want it to come into a full GWS moment, but would you be more intrigued in buying Cornelio this week, given the buy low perception where he's at? He's dropped over around about 100,000 across Dream Team and AFL Fantasy, around about 80,000 or so in SuperCoach. Are you more tempted to buy low on him, even if his ownership's relatively higher, than at a not quite a peak price, but about the price range you'd expect for a slightly less owned Josh Kelly? Where's your leaning kind of that if it came down to a Kelly v Cornelio this week and for the rest of the year? What's kind of the defining decisions if you're making that Whitfield to trade to one of those two?
Yeah, well, Cornelio's not going to get any cheaper at all. Like, this is his basement right now. So I think you need to think around what the dollar difference is between him and Kelly. And again, to what we've talked about, what else can you do with that money, particularly in light of 3 trades? So just think if there's, and I don't know what the dollar difference is, maybe 150, 180 grand between the two across the limited trade formats. If you can then do a downgrade somewhere as well, and then, create yourself an extra 300k, you can potentially do 2 upgrades. So and to Benny's point before around finishing your side earlier, might be a unique way of doing it. Looking at Cornelio like this, or even, we saw Angus Brayshaw actually play in the guts last week for the first time for a while. Whilst his scoring wasn't quite there, you could see that role was coming back. So, a similar mindset there as well. Do well with your money and be frugal with your money across the buys, because it's got to get you across potentially 9 trades and across 3 rounds to be positioned coming out in an unbeatable, a full team or close enough to it that you can actually then have a good run home.
Yeah, fair enough too. And there's some players I do want to talk about, Sloan and Hearn, in just a moment, that have some injuries that are of less significance. There is an possibility, according to the Crows medical staff, who may not have, Matt Crouch owners might not have the greatest faith in right now, what they say, but Shannon Hearn looks like he's going to miss the next couple of weeks. Before we talk about them, Ben, what's some general advice that are going to help coaches get through these next 3 weeks? Because Rainman's, given that great concept around, you've got 9 trades over the next 3 weeks, improving your side, making sure you're maximising your cash in those trades. Is there some nuggets of gold from your years of playing fantasy footy, multiple different formats, that coaches either may not think of or may have, but just not given as much weight as they could have too?
Yeah, well, there's a couple, mate. I think number one for me is the value of having more than 18 playing cannot be understated. The potential of you having a 19th or 20th player means that, hey, if someone goes off for an early injury, I know one of the Geelong rookies went off for a 2 earlier this season. I can't remember off the top of my head who it was, but you have a score like that. Someone gets injured early in the game, you can write that off. You do not have to accept that as part of your 18. That's very exciting. So you may have a guy that gets 30. You might have a Robert Young, but hey, look, mate, if you haven't got him in the top 18, then you do not have to sweat about it. And you've also got to be thinking about how many premiums do you have playing within that group. So a lot of people are going to speak over the next few weeks, hey, I had 18 or 19 playing, but also they're looking at their team and they only had, 10 premiums on the field or something like that. So that's going to be a big issue. That's number one. The number two thing I think that everyone needs to be looking at right now is round 13 is going to be a big problem. Don't be trading in. I feel very comfortable in making this call. Don't be trading in anyone from round 13 either this week or obviously next week. I think that's going to be across the board. That's going to be a huge weakness area for everyone. I can see teams fielding, potentially teams that have even been thinking about it, fielding 16, 17 type players for the week. We don't know whether some of these rookies, have been recently dropped. We don't know if they're going to come back. We don't know if there's going to be an injury. I mean, there could be an injury to a round 14 guy right now that really throws things out of whack. So I would be planning around trying to minimize any round 13 intake at this stage. The beauty with round 14, guys, is that if all works out well for us teams-wise next week, we might be able to trade out 1 or 2 round 13. We can get rid of a round 14 guy and happy days, but we really need to be thinking very heavily, and I hope you've been doing it before this podcast, but we need to be heavily thinking about how we're going to mitigate what I can see as being a potential disaster come next week. Yeah.
So what can we do this week, Rainman, to help us prepare for next week now? Whitfield, in one regards, is a blessing in disguise, potentially, that helps us get there. Is there any things we can do outside of the Whitfield trade, making some cash, preparing some room? Is there any other things we can do this week that's going to help minimise either the pain next week or give us that little extra edge heading into round 13?
Firstly, I just want to say, really sage advice by Benny. So, just follow that, and particularly about the more than 18 players. I think the amount of times over the years that you've had, to his point, we've had 20 or 21 coming up and you've had 3 stinkers and you're actually wiping them off, which is just an amazing feeling as a coach, and in which you could do it every round. I think from a round 13 perspective, again, I support what Benny said there, and I think the only way to start to look at it is, again, think around this thing as 3 weeks. So I mentioned before, more than likely what I might do, and it might be hugely risky, is I'm just full of round 13 defenders. Each other line I'm actually not too bad in, but defenders are killing me. So, I can use a bit of DPP this week to go, a Lockhart to a Brett Bewley, for argument's sake, or a similar round 12 player, whilst I'm not getting any benefit this week, but I've got enough players that I can actually do that. But it's then helping me, because I'm so heavy in round 13 defenders, then next week, that's one less trade I have to think about. So hopefully Bewley gets through, it makes me some cash, and then it helps me get rid of whether it be an Answorth or a Hoare or whoever in my defence to a Sicily or a Blakely or, potentially somebody else from that round 12 bye might be a Luke Ryan for argument's sake. So I think if you can use this week to help you out, particularly for that round 13, you're silly not to.
Yeah, I like that. Look, Shannon Hearn, we've talked about a couple of times. He's going to miss this week, definitely the subsequential week with West Coast having the bye. And then a likely out, at least at this stage, of missing round 14. So that's a huge thing for coaches to ponder. And then Rory Sloane came off early in the second with a hamstring concern. The club have said he's doing everything right thus far. But for the past 3 weeks, we've also heard that from Matt Crouch. So take it for what you will. Even if Rory Sloane does play this week, they come up against GWS. And you can guarantee it, my friends, that if Rory Sloane does play, he has got the human glove heading his way, Benny, in Matt DeBoer, and that is not going to be a great week for him, even if he is able to get out on the field.
No, that's it. Matt DeBoer, what a tagger. He's just been phenomenal. So he's another guy. We're looking at trading him, I think. That's where I'd land on that, because you've bought him, he's increased in value, I think, across the competitions now.
Yep.
He's obviously more than done what's required of him. The other interesting little tad bit with Rory Sloane, he's been notoriously more of a SuperCoach player. So this season has been a bit unusual for him from a Dream Team and AFL Fantasy perspective in terms of what he's been able to achieve. So he averaged 112 up until last week. So he's now looking at a break-even of 160 in Dream Team, and it's probably going to be very high in AFL Fantasy as well. I'm looking at that, and I'm thinking, can we potentially make some type of move here and get a bit, funky with this type of situation? Because I really don't want to be in a situation where DeBoer's gone to him, and we all know that Rory Sloane has struggled with attack in the past.
Yeah.
There is a serious case to be made that he goes sub 50 if he plays, especially if he's playing sore. And you know what likelihood is, if he's playing, he's going to be playing sore.
Yeah.
And it's a big game, so they're going to be trying to push, because even if he turns out and DeBoer takes him out, at least that doesn't mean that Brad Crouch got taken out of the game. It does serve a purpose for the footy club. But obviously it would hurt fantasy coaches no end. I mean, if he comes out and he scores a 50, then the decision to trade was a huge success. But even at this stage, I mean, if he went hundreds from this point on, it'd still be losing value. He's not necessarily a guy that I have a lot of faith and belief in that he will finish well on the run home, because he's just been so susceptible to the tag. So, look, if I was an owner and I've got Whitfield, I'd be thinking, hey, can I get Whitfield, Sloane, and potentially a rookie to 3 premiums, and potentially have some money to spare as well. So that's where I'm thinking at it. But happy days if you've bought Rory Sloane, or you've had him from the start. This is a huge success. So whichever way you play it from here, be very happy with the selection, because it's, I wish I picked him, MJ.
Well, yes, no, and understandable. So I think we talked about it in the 50 Most Relevant a fair bit too at the preseason, but that's all right. Rainman, what about Shannon Hearn? We're spending a lot of time talking about these injured players, and that's fair enough too, because it's really the big decision points for coaches this week. Is he in the same conversation as Sloane from Ben's perspective, and definitely from both of you, as you've talked about Whitfield and the need to move him on? Is Hearn like that too? Is it he's done his job, move him on? Or is it if you can afford it, wait a week and then move him on? Well, what should coaches with Hearn be doing? Because at the moment, he's definitely delivering numbers across all formats to be amongst the top few defenders at the moment.
Yeah, I think quickly before I talk about Hearn, I own both Whitfield and Sloane, so I'm that coach. Outside of that, I think Hearn for me is a hold. I think what he has done and what he's done consistently, particularly with the new kick-out rules, is just show how dominant he can be. And even his bad games aren't bad. So I think across the formats, he's a top 6 defender. I think he's out probably 2 weeks, but I think it's worth a watch and assess if you can this week, and I think most teams will be in the position to do that. If not, if you really want to bite the bullet, it's finding that player that you know is going to be a top 6 defender as well. So unless you're going to do a bit of loop-de-loop magic, which we talked out with Whitfield, I think trying to find somebody that has the bang for buck that Hearn does, with actually a pretty decent injury history, in a rich vein of form. West Coast are really starting to hit their straps. He's going to come back, my thoughts are, pretty good for probably what is a 2-week injury at most. I'd be likely to hold.
All right. Fair enough too. Lads, appreciate all of your thoughts on those players. Want to jump to some of our Patreon on questions in a moment, but are there any players that we haven't highlighted that are potential trade targets that either of you are keen to share with Coaches Panel listeners? Because we talked a lot about Whitfield, Hearn and Sloan and potential trade movements and players. Are there some guys we just haven't thrown their name out that you want to throw either some curveballs or a unique option or a real obvious candidate that we haven't talked about? Benny, we'll go to you first. Is there any player names we should seriously be considering bringing in either to get us through the multi-buy rounds or to maximise our cash and trades that we haven't spent any time on?
There always are, MJ. How much I'm willing to divulge, that's another thing. But we'll throw out a couple of names.
Sure.
So someone that's going under the radar at the moment, probably for fairly good reason, but he was very hot property in the pre-season, is Alex Witherden. So he's had back-to-back 50s. It's not going well for Alex. But, geez, he is becoming a very interesting proposition for non-owners. Look, he started the season at 630K, and a lot of the community were thinking that this guy's actually got upside. So he averaged 89 points in Dream Team last season, and he'd done that the previous season, 88. Now he's, prior to the past fortnight, he still had a fairly average season, but he was actually averaging 86. So it's only been 2 weeks of this very poor form, and that, to me, is starting to scream bargain. Now we're talking about a round 13 player, so I think we're potentially waiting a week on this guy. We're going to see how he goes against Carlton, but, geez, he's an exciting prospect to bring in round 14. There are a heap of midfielders, mate.
Well, for SuperCoach, before you tell us about some of those, in SuperCoach, he's priced just a couple of $100 over $380,000, and has just dipped his seasonal average beneath 80 for the first time. But there is about 4 or 5 scores in the 90s through there, and as a reference point, if just purely focusing on him for the moment, because I know you're going to hit some midfielders, but for pretty much a touch over $100,000, that's Lockhart to Witherden, or maybe Darcy Moore is actually a cash-making opportunity for you. Move on. Yeah,
well, back to Dream Team. I mean, it's going to be a downgrade to go Dersma to Witherden.
Wow.
Within a week or two, it's going to be absurd. So that's an exciting proposition. I mean, maybe it doesn't quite work out buys-wise, but you get a real idea of the situation. Obviously, there's some round 12 guys, so Jack McRae's the obvious one. I mean, this guy's got to be hugely on everyone's radar at the moment. I understand he hasn't gone 100 in Dream. Well, he's gone 100 in Dream Team once in the last 6, but he was the guy last year. And we need to be keeping that in mind. When a guy drops $220,000 in value, and you're still fairly happy with his role, I mean, he is still primarily a midfielder. We've got to be looking at him. We've got to be thinking about it. Seb Ross is another one that's had a fairly average season to this point, but hey, he's still averaging 90. He hasn't scored 100 in his last 5, but we know how this guy can go absurd. He could be the top scoring player from this moment on in the season. It would not shock me at all. It just revolves around the role for him. So if we're looking at potentially Richo deciding that, hey, this is going to be something that we want to do now with Ross, I'm just spitballing here, but hey, if we see any sign that he's an inside midfielder, we have to be seriously bringing him in. And then there's one other name that I think I don't want to speak up too much, but we do have Rainman on the pod at the moment. Like if you're a fantasy coach in 2019 and you're not looking at Patrick Cripps right now, then I seriously have to question whether you're playing the right game. So that's all I'm going to say on that matter, but there's quite a few options there for you.
Rainman, what about for you? There's some names, and I am keen to get your thoughts on Patrick Cripps. I know he's really struggled over the past few weeks with, one, really carrying the midfield, and two, some ridiculously heavy tagging. So maybe I'll get your thoughts on Cripps and the value opportunity for non-owners, and then secondly maybe some other players that Benny didn't highlight, if you've got others, that could be some nice on the run home pickups that we haven't talked about yet.
I think on Cripps, he's carried the weight, and I think to be honest, the media speculation floating around Carlton with the captaincy on his shoulders hasn't helped either. I don't think he's a guy that generally lets any of that stuff impact him, but to your point around the way that he's been battered, the way that side has performed, and they've really mixed in and out their inside mids as well. So, Kennedy's been back for a couple of weeks, Setterfield's been in and out. There's been not a real lot of congruence for him, so I think he is absolutely a wonderful buy, and you know that I'm completely biased with Paddy Cripps, so I couldn't go any further there. I think another couple that jump out for me, and these are really left field, and these, I guess, have been fantasy darlings of the past, and they do come with a little bit of risk. So particularly SuperCoach and round 12, we've seen what he did in China last week. Robbie Gray, he's about 400 grand, which is an absolute steal. Now, we know with Robbie, it's all about role. So if he's in the midfield, he's a SuperCoach darling. If he's stuck up forward, he can give you a 40 or a 50. So with Wines and Rockcliffe out, I think that's been really good. How long that lasts, I don't know. So you are going in with a fair element of risk, but we know that he's got the fantasy chops to do it. The other one, which is a little bit left field, if you're a coach that's carrying O'Brien at R2, because I know there are some coaches that are doing that, and you're really concerned around that round 13 buy coming up with Gawn and Grundy, and you've got one of them, what about Matty Cruiser? He's cheap as chips. He's starting to run back into some good form. I think he got about 110 in SuperCoach across the weekend. I know, again, it comes with risk around what his injury history is like. He's already had a few weeks out this year. Is that his injury's done for the year, or does he actually have some more injuries to come? But I think that whole Carlton side, I would certainly hope for me and for my fantasy team, they start to rejuvenate, they start to play a little bit freer with maybe a different structure or a different way of working under David Teague across the rest of the year until a new coach is appointed. Maybe there's something there. I think with the price of both Gray and Cruiser, the risk is factored into that price. So if you're willing to take the plunge, you could be handsomely rewarded.
I like it. There's some really interesting names and a real opportunity to go left of centre, to get some unique opportunities in your side to set yourself apart, whether it be for leagues as you focus on those crucial matchups in the final 8 or so games of the year, or you need to give yourself some uniqueness to your side to just give you that rankings edge and point of difference through there. It's very, very important to consider that, and something that no doubt we'll talk more at coachespanel.tv and at next week's podcast, as well as we get our first 6 sides coming off the multi-buy round. Let's get to some of the questions from our Patreons. If you want to join the Patreon army, you can support the Coaches Panel by doing that at patreon.com/Coaches Panel. Our first question comes from John Coombs. I'm going to throw it out. It's an interesting one too, and our Coel Kings are going to spend a lot of time answering it, but we'll quickly go through it. He said, who are some good captain options for each of the buy rounds? So I'll read you the fixture for each. Just give me 1 or 2 names off the top of your head. Again, every format's different, but round 12, Tigers v Cats, Blues v Lions, Suns v Roos, Crows v Giants, and Swans v Eagles. And then it wraps up with the Pies versus the Demons. Rainman, a couple of captain options from there for you, just top of the head.
Yeah, I don't mind Lachie Neale versus the Blues. He's been a bit down recently. Okay. I think he'll bounce back. I think they will. They'll probably traditionally put the clamps on Zorks, and I think that'll continue with Ed Curnow running with him. So I think that frees Neale up a little bit. And probably in the Monday game, I might look at Maxi. There's obviously, Brody wasn't himself last week, So Maxi maybe has some fantasy chops about him.
All right. Any of those games or potential matchups for you, Benny, of excitement?
Mate, I wasn't even listening. I was already looking at round 13.
All right, well, let me ask you the round 13 ones then. Crows v Tigers, Bombers v Hawks, Suns versus Saints, Dockers take on the Power, Blues versus the Dogs, and the Kangaroos versus the Giants.
Yeah, well, I think I'm looking towards the Giants game a little bit with this one. So Kelly's someone that's in serious form at the moment. He looks to be over his injuries. He's someone that you seriously got to be looking at. And the exciting thing with Kelly is that you can, make him the captain. You can have a pot shot at the vice. So, there's a few options if you're looking at that Essendon Hawthorn game. I mean, Hawthorn haven't really been doing much tagging recently. Zach Merritt is in hot form. He's someone, if I was an owner of him, I'd be looking strongly at the vice captaincy there. Carlton, Western Bulldogs, you feel like someone's going to get off the chain for the Dogs, and vice versa. I don't even mind Patrick Cripps being an option there, especially if you've got Kelly as a backup. So, yeah, there's some names in for round 13.
And also for AFL fantasy coaches, during that multi-bye round, with the Thursday night matchup, you do get an opportunity that Dream Teamers and Super Coaches get every single week, which is a vice captaincy loophole. So you'll be looking at Crows and Tigers that week. And you'll also get an opportunity in round 14. Rainman, I'll get your thoughts. Some possible captain options that, again, our Cowell Kings will give you their thoughts at coachespanel.tv. But the Thursday night game, which is important for fantasy coaches, Eagles take on the Bombers over at Optus Stadium. Swans v Hawks, D's v Dockers, Saints versus the Lions, the Power take on the Cats, and then to wrap up the last of our multi-bye rounds, it's the Dogs and the Magpies. Any interesting options there, mate?
Gaff at home is always good,
yep.
And very much worth a free hit. I think Fyfe has been in a very rich vein of form, so I'd probably see that continuing even if he gets the harms run with. So that'd probably be two that jump out to me, particularly from a super coach perspective. I guess depending on what happens around injuries and so forth, if Hearn was potentially back for that Eagles game, he just eats everything up at Optus. So it could be a really sneaky free hit VC on the Thursday night.
All right, fair enough.
There's one really big one as well. Brodie Grundy against the Bulldogs' young ruckman. That's going to be a feast.
Yeah, that's going to get nasty. That's
we've already seen that play out this season as well. So, I mean he's going to do very well there. So, just looking at his score, Western Bulldogs round 4, he scored 153 in Dream Team. I think he did something similar, if not more, in SuperCoach. So.
All right.
He'd be the guy for me personally.
All right, fair enough. Rayman, I'll throw this question over to you. Louis Fryer, one of the great Patreons we have here. I know he plays a lot of AFL fantasy, but I think it's worth it in all formats to throw the question out there. Is Zach Williams an option to bring back in with Whitfield out?
Absolutely is an option, but does he come with risk? He does. So, I think where does he play with Whitfield out is quite an interesting one. Does he play that rebounding defence, or because he's got that run and carry, do they actually throw him to the wing? And how's he going to recover on his first game back without Whitfield? So for me, it actually probably raises a question. I think when he was picked at the start of the year, he wasn't looked at as a keeper. Do you see him as a keeper now? If you do, knock yourself out. I don't know whether he is SuperCoach. He's probably close. He's probably a good D7.
Yep.
In the other formats, I'd probably be a bit reluctant.
Yeah, all right, fair enough. He's got another question. I'll throw it over to you, Benny. Again, he plays a lot more AFL fantasy, but I think it's a conversation that across all formats to look at. He says, is it worth looking at someone like a Cumming or a Perryman as a possible player to get you through the multi-bye rounds, whether that be a downgrade from Whitfield and look to make some cash along the way, or an upgrade from a guy like a Myers and a Lockhart type? Is Perryman or Cumming someone of interest to you through those formats?
Yeah, absolutely. We already touched on Cumming, but Perryman's very, very exciting prospect. He's been playing a bit off half back, a bit through the midfield. He's someone that's just absolutely needed to start playing AFL because he's ready for that level. And He actually got injured in round 1 against the Bombers, so his last 3 weeks he has been going at 91 in Dream Team.
90 in
AFL
SuperCoach.
Fantasy. Yep, so he's had a pretty good draw, to be honest with you, but you're looking at him right now and you're thinking, okay, can he maybe take me to round 14 and potentially make me a few dollars? I don't mind it. It wouldn't be my first option, though.
Mm-hmm.
So I would make that point. But, hey, if you're looking at something you really like Harry Perryman and you think that, hey, 90 is going to be his low end, then that becomes a very exciting prospect. But
it's probably more
like
an AFL fantasy trade, isn't it? More, of the formats to make that move, isn't it?
Absolutely, it is. But you've also got to be thinking if AFL fantasy, well, like we've been speaking about at length tonight, we've been thinking about what is the other trade going to allow me to do. So if we're going to Cumming, we're going to be making a lot more money. What's the difference in that upgrade potential on the second trade? And that's the way I'd be thinking, and I would be thinking that there probably is a fairly, large size gap there. So yeah, I would probably be going to Cumming in this situation, but AFL Fantasy is such an interesting game. There are so many aspects to it. So, Perryman could well be the right choice. It's very difficult to tell.
Yeah, no, and fair enough kind of thought process through there as well. A lot of questions about Whitfield, a lot of questions about is it worth jumping early on premiums from round 12. We've kind of spent a whole heap of time talking about all of those things right throughout a big chunk of the podcast episode. And that pretty much wraps us up for this week. Hey, Rainman, appreciate your thoughts this week as we've talked through a whole chunk of stuff on this episode.
No problem, MJ.
And Benny, as always, a pleasure, mate.
Thanks, mate. It was very good fun to chat with you and Rainman.
Yeah, no, always love having both of you boys on these podcast episodes. And if you are loving the podcast, make sure you subscribe, whether it be via iTunes or Spotify, so that as soon as the weekly strategy podcast episode goes live, not only do you get notified, but it goes straight to your handheld device. You can leave a 5-star rating and a review. And of course, articles dropping all the time at coachespanel.tv. Round 1 of the multi-buy rounds is here, and it's presented a couple of stumbling blocks for us already. But coaches that plan, that get aggressive, and that adapt over these 3-week periods and get a little bit of luck going their way could see a massive ranking spike and a few league wins going their way that they didn't expect. Good luck this week. I hope everything goes your way. And from all of us here at the Coaches Panel, well, we'll chat to you soon.